Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Community Archives lecture, Community Participation Part 1. So we'll be looking at community participation again later on in the semester. For this week we'll mostly focus on broader issues related to community participation and kind of an overview of community participation. And then when we discuss community participation again, we'll focus more on case studies and discuss how the case studies that we look at relate to some of the issues that we will be discussing this week. Okay, so here are our weekly topics. How does community participation support the formation and enhancement of identity? How can community members participate in the formation of social memory through participatory archiving? How can communities determine who can participate in record-keeping decisions? And what are some barriers to community participation in participatory archiving? So we'll start by looking at some of the different categories of archives or memory projects that the Benoit chapter that we read for this week discuss. So mediated archives, less mediated archives, or non-mediated archives. So looking at mediated archives, as the Benoit article notes on page 160, in mediated archives, the community voice may not be present at all. It may just be the authoritative voice of the archivist that is present in the different record-keeping decisions that the archive makes. And even if there are community voices present, they are still mediated through an institutional body. So the community may have some participation in record-keeping decisions surrounding records, but ultimately it is the archivist or maybe a few archivists that make determinations about record-keeping decisions surrounding the records in the archive's care. Benoit notes that community participation in mediated archives may be focused around a specific event, and he gives some examples of those events. So it may not necessarily be broad participation. It may just be, okay, this event occurred and we have records related to this event, so let's have some community participation in describing this event, or community participation in making appraisal decisions about records related to this event. So the participation by community members may not be very deep because, again, archivists are making a lot of the mediative decisions with the records, and it may not be very broad. It may just be focused on events and not records related to a variety of other topics, which may also be a part of the community and a part of the community's history. So participation in traditional archives may be pretty superficial if true power sharing is not the goal of the archives and of the community whose records the archives is holding. So there has to be a willingness on the behalf of the traditional archives to facilitate community participation, and of course there has to be a willingness and interest by members of that community to participate in record-keeping decisions surrounding records that mediated archives have custody of. And we'll talk about some of the things that may get in the way of this mutual desire or mutual goal to share power later on in the lecture. So we also have less mediated and non-mediated archival spaces. And this is something that Benoit and his co-authors connect to more of a community archive archival space. So one in which the voice of the archivist is reduced, if not absent entirely. And it's important to note the importance of participation in community archives and in spaces that seek to represent communities. As we talked about in the very beginning of this class, community participation is what makes a community archive a community archive. So it is an incredibly powerful force that is important for the creation and the sustainment of community archives and similar archival projects. One interesting thing that the Benoit article or chapter notes is that community archives may begin as non-mediated archival spaces, and over time they may evolve into less mediated or even mediated spaces as time passes and as the project develops. So this might occur as community archives become more formalized. It might occur as community archives bring on professional archivists or grant archival powers to members of the community. It may happen as community archives enter into partnerships with more traditional mainstream archives. So it may be the case that a community archive starts out very informally with very little centralized power in a space that is very free of mediation, and one that is very open to participation by a variety of community members with very little insider input on the behalf of an archivist, to a space where the participation by community members may go through some mediative process. And we'll talk about some of the partnerships that community archives can enter into later on. And this shift might also be related to sustainability, which is an issue that we'll discuss later on in this semester as well. So we'll look at some of the results of this possible shift from community archives and community memory projects being less or non-mediated to more mediated archival spaces. So next, we'll talk a little bit more about participatory archives more generally. And this is a slide that we looked at during our discussion about how community archives challenge traditional archives. And a lot of that challenge does come from the participation of community members in the record-keeping decisions surrounding records that are held in traditional archives or more formal mediative spaces. So we talked about how a more, I would argue, nuanced and contemporary approach to archiving recognizes that if people have some connection to an official record, or if a personal record is connected to a community or to communities, then people represented in those records should have some way to participate in the record-keeping decisions surrounding those records, even if they aren't in a community archive. If they are in a more formal archive, contemporary archival thought would argue that people represented in records should have some power over how the records are appraised, how the records are described, how the records are maintained, who has access to them, and so on. And as Benoit notes on page 161, this type of relationship requires that archives move away from the notion that they are neutral and authoritative. So once you start sharing power with community members, once you start facilitating their participation in record-keeping decisions around records, you, in a lot of ways, are admitting that the record-keeping decisions that you've made previously that have excluded community members have resulted in archives that don't portray all the sides of the story and have chosen one side over other sides to be represented in archives. And this is something that archives might find quite challenging because basically it involves archives admitting that they are wrong. And, you know, that's not something that people generally like to hear. You've done this wrong, so let's help you fix that. But that's really what an openness to participatory archiving by mainstream archives is saying. We've gotten this wrong in the past, and so we're going to take steps to attempt to right the ship a little bit. And this participation in formal archives and other more mediated spaces is really important and necessary because oftentimes they are going to be the archives that are particularly well known, particularly well supported, at least as much as any archive is well supported. And researchers may consider them to have the most authoritative voice. So because of the value that archives have and the authority that people ascribe to archives, it's important that community members are able to make record-keeping decisions surrounding the records in mainstream archives, again, assuming that those records have some connection to a particular person or to a particular community. Okay, so next we'll look at one of our weekly topics: how does community participation support the formation and enhancement of identity? So broadly speaking, as Benoit notes on page 167, participatory archives may document groups underrepresented in traditional archives. So participatory archives may result in groups or communities that have not been represented in archives to have some form of representation. And as we talked about before, seeing this representation of yourself or of your community in an archives can really help someone feel a sense of representational belonging, can feel a sense of embellishment to their identity and a sense of embellishment to, you know, who they are and where they came from. The Benoit article also notes on page 166 that non-mediated archives may document events outside of the radar of traditional archives. But these events may still document important aspects of the community. So if participatory archiving is focused on representing these events and providing different contexts and perspectives of these events, then again, that can just enrich the sense of identity that a community member has, because they can see this representation of an event that was potentially very important to their community and their community's history that previously was unavailable. And again, that can really strengthen a person's sense of representational belonging and in turn, their identity. Obviously, having a representation of physical spaces that are important to a community can do the same thing. If you see a representation of a community center that was really important to your community and had a big role in shaping your community's history, perhaps it was a site of activism or a site of protest or a site of an important historical event that impacted your community, then having that physical space and having that history represented can be something that can strengthen a person's sense of identity as well, again, through a sense of connectedness to the past. So participatory archives can support identity through helping community members share their varied and sometimes contradictory perspectives about these four types of representation. And by doing that, they may be able to develop a history and a sense of identity within their community that previously didn't exist, because community members were not given any chance, or perhaps given only limited chances, to facilitate the representation of their loved ones, to facilitate the representation of their community members, and so on, in a way that is accessible to the community members and to the public at large. Related to something that we've talked about in this lecture on page 201, Roland talks about how community participation involves the ceding of top-down power to citizens. And again, that can result in a representation of community members and spaces and relationships and events in archives and in social memory that had not occurred before. And just the act of contributing to the expansion or establishment of memories related to loved ones or to your community can strengthen a person's identity as well. So not only having those representations exist through a participatory archive, but actually participating in a project that helps these representations take place. I think that would be a really powerful experience for someone who has felt marginalized and has felt overlooked in the past, to take an active role in participating in their community's history and the development of that history, and taking power and taking action and working to fight against a marginalization that has occurred in the past. I think that that would be very empowering, and it is something that would make someone think about who they were as a person and the different attributes of their personality and of their identity. Perhaps it would lead a person to feel more strongly about a particular identity that they have. And that really can enhance a person's sense of who they are and how they fit into society as a whole. It's interesting to think of how participatory archiving can fit into the principles of community-centric framework that we've looked at a few times in this course. On page 161 in the Benoit chapter, the author is, quote, Huivila, who states, in part, that inclusion and greater participation is supposed to reveal a diversity of motivations, viewpoints, arguments, and counter-arguments, which becomes transparency when a critical mass is attained. So I think we can really connect this with the third principle here, one in which community complexity and flux are recognized, honored, and brought to bear in archival practice. So participation can allow the viewpoints, motivations, arguments, and counter arguments of a community to really be shared with other community members and with the public at large. And that can really help portray the community that is being documented as one that is complex, that has changed over time, that has different demographics and emotions, as opposed to a monolith that may not be an accurate representation of the actual community. And the more these motivations and viewpoints and arguments and counter arguments are achieved and maintained through participation, the more complex of an identity of a community is going to be represented in an archive. And that may increase the chances of a person seeing different aspects of their community and feeling a sense of resonance between what they're seeing and learning about their community and who they are as a person. So if a community is represented in a very flat, kind of one-dimensional way, then that may lead community members who don't feel like that flat, one-dimensional way represents them and their experiences as a community member to feel like their identity doesn't count, isn't relevant to the community, and that can be damaging in a lot of ways, and it's not going to help a person feel this sense of representational belonging and a sense of connection to a particular community. However, if all these motivations, viewpoints, and so on are represented in archives through participatory archiving, that just prevents such a wider perspective of what a community is and how the different members of a community interact and sometimes conflict with each other. And seeing that complex history can allow more people to feel a sense of connection to a community and can increase the sense of identity that they have. So you could also connect this to the first principle here: community interests, needs, and well-being are central. If a community archive or if an archive doesn't consider the community's interests, needs, and well-being to be central, then the level of participation that community members have or can have access to may be quite limited. And this formation and enhancement of identity may not take place. If the community is not represented in their original context, or if records produced by a community are not represented in their original context because community members don't have the opportunity to participate in record-keeping decisions surrounding a set of records, then that may make it more difficult to support the identity of community members. So in a lot of ways, participation by community members in archives does support a lot of the different aspects of this community-centric framework. And a lot of these aspects and a lot of these connections are ones that can support the formation and enhancement of a community's identity and the identities of individual community members. So next we'll talk about how community members can participate in the formation of social memory through participatory archiving. So what can this participation by community members look like? As Roland notes on page 198, participation may take place even before the creation of records. So community members may participate in ensuring that certain records about their community or about their community's experience are created. And participatory actions may take place after the records are created. So there may be a way for community members to participate in record keeping decisions surrounding the record after the records have been created. And we'll talk about more specifically what some of these types of creation or types of participation beyond creation in just a little bit. On page 215, Roland mentions the annotation of materials in custody, and he talks about how this can range from submitting links to narrating personal connections. So annotation is one way that community members can participate in archiving. And again, ideally, these annotations are going to result in a broader and more complex portrayal of a community being available for people to interact with and understand and incorporate into social memory. As Roland notes on page 203, it's important that this participation is meaningful. If it's not, it may lead to what Roland calls pseudo-participation, or participation which is very superficial and doesn't allow for community members to actually have much of a role in shaping how the community is represented, how the community is memorialized, how the community is viewed by people within the community and from outside of the community as well. Roland also notes that participation may actually lead to disenfranchisement if the wrong people are the ones that are participating in record-keeping decisions surrounding a particular record. Of course, determining who the right people are can be pretty complex and difficult, and that's something that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But again, the key takeaway here is that through participating in archives, community members can develop a representation of their community that is nuanced, that has the complexity and flux that we talked about before, and that can lead people to have a more accurate understanding of the community and can work against some of the marginalization and symbolic annihilation, which, as we've discussed, is one of the main reasons why community archives exist in the first place. As I mentioned before, community participation or participatory archiving can be either really deep and meaningful or really shallow and fairly inconsequential. And Roland describes on page 201 a scale of behavior ranging from disengagement to a comprehensive sharing of power. And where an archival space falls along that spectrum will determine the breadth and depth of the participation in decisions surrounding record keeping that community members will be able to engage with and influence. So the more deeply community members are able to engage in participatory acts, the more they'll be able to shape social memory through their participatory archiving. If what they're allowed to do is pretty superficial, like maybe some very superficial annotations, then that may have a pretty limited impact on social memory, and it may reduce the ability of community members to portray a complex representation of their community. If community members are allowed to have very deep participation in record-keeping decisions, then that will give them more power in shaping social memory in a way that may be more reflective of the community and its history. So again, it's not simply enough to just facilitate community participation or to facilitate participatory archiving. In order for meaningful change to take place, it has to be community participation that is deep and is broad. So to look at some more specific record-keeping processes and decisions that archives make, it's important to think of how community members can influence how archives act and the decisions that archives make in a way that does help them shape social memory. As the Srinivasan article mentions on page 89, broadly speaking, leaving marginalized voices out of the historical record results in historic disenfranchisement. So if community members aren't able or aren't allowed to participate in record-keeping decisions, if they are excluded from the historic record because their perspective is not invited or welcomed into archives, then that does disenfranchise them. It does rob them of the power that they have to represent themselves. And obviously this disenfranchisement can create holes in social memory because the perspectives and histories and complexities and motivations of communities and different community members will be lost and left out. So it's interesting to look at some of these different record-keeping acts and talk about how community members can participate in or influence archival decisions surrounding record keeping that are related to appraisal, creation, documentation, preservation, access, and disposal. So how can community members participate in a way that can truly shape social memory? So looking at appraisal, the Shilton article discusses the possibility of a consultation between an archive and community members over appraisal decisions. So having some kind of way for community members to participate in determining which records are really important for documenting a community and incorporating those decisions into appraisal decisions that archives make when they are determining which records to bring into an archival repository for long-term care and access. So by doing this, community members will be able to have an influence on which records survive to shape social memory, or which records are more accessible to shape social memory. So obviously this can be a pretty important type of participatory archiving that can go a long way towards shaping social memory. an archival process that I've touched on earlier that community members can participate in is helping determine which records are created in the first place. And this is something that the Roland article touches on. So helping community members participate in discussions over which records related to their community should be created because those records are most likely to meaningfully represent the community in the future. So if the community has some kind of activity or event going on, they may work with archivists beforehand to say, okay, well, we think that this event is important. We think that these aspects of this event are going to be important. So we want to make sure that these records are created in order for these records to be accessible in the future. So this is another pretty influential type of participation that community members can be involved with, which again can have quite a bit of impact on social memory in the future. Documentation is also an important process that community members can participate in order to shape social memory. So the Shilton article talks about consultation between an archive and community members over arrangement and description decisions. The article touches on the need to recognize parallel provenances. Again, this idea that even if community members didn't necessarily create records, they should still have some ability to influence how the records are arranged and described. The Shilton article touches on basing the order of archival collections on communities and individuals' architectures of knowledge instead of the architectures of knowledge for people that aren't a part of a particular community, and also using community groups to facilitate the formation of community ontologies. The Haberstock article mentions metadata creation and enhancement as something that community members can be involved in and participate in the documentation of their community in that way. And the author talks about how description can serve as a way to connect silence groups with records and archives. So participation in the documentation of the community by community members can provide them with the opportunity to be represented within records that are in archives. So it may be that a archive has records that are related to a particular community, but for whatever reason, that particular community isn't represented in a FindAid or another access tool. And so participatory description can give community members the opportunity to provide some additional information about that collection, and by doing so, have themselves and their community represented in archival description and in archives. And the Haberstock article also talks about how participation in description can lead to a decolonization of terminology used to describe communities. So this is something that we have discussed earlier on in this class about how oftentimes records may be described in a way that is inaccurate or misleading or even offensive and hurtful. And if community members are able to participate in the documentation of a community, then they may use terminology that is more accurate and more respectful of the community and of the community's history. And you know, words matter. If a community is represented in a particular way in an archive, then that may lead researchers and other members of society to feel like, okay, well, that's the correct way to refer to this particular group of people. And so allowing community members to or helping community members make decisions about the terminology that's used to describe them can result in what researchers and what the public sees in an archive and an archival fine aid just being more respectful and more accurate, and that can have an impact on social memory. Looking at preservation, community members may have particular views about how records should be preserved, even whether they should be preserved. And this may be based on particular cultural beliefs that the community has. And if a community says, well, we think it's wrong to preserve these records, they should just be left to decay because that's a part of our culture, then that can impact social memory as well, because it may result in the loss of information which otherwise would survive without the community participating in these preservation discussions. So that may be unfortunate, but also it's respectful of the community and of their culture and of their wishes. And for that reason, that's something that archives should really think about doing. Access may also be something that may need to incorporate cultural considerations. And this is a point that the Haberstock article makes. So if a community feels it's inappropriate or wrong for people outside of a community to view and interact with and access particular records, then their participation in decisions surrounding access to archival materials can shape social memory as well. Again, it may result in a loss of information to the public, to members of the public that are outside of the community, but it may well be that that's the respectful thing to do. It is the respectful thing to do. Archivists should listen to the cultural considerations of the people that the records are documenting when they are making access decisions. Full point. End of discussion. And it may be difficult for archives to be aware of these cultural considerations, or they may not feel as much pressure to adhere to them if they don't have participation from community members when making access decisions. And cultural considerations might come into play when the disposal of records is being discussed by archives as well. So community members may state that according to their tradition, records need to be, a particular type of record needs to be disposed of in a particular way. And, that's an important consideration for archivists to make as well. So having talked a little bit about what participatory archiving is and some of the different forms that participatory archiving might take and how participatory archiving can support and enhance the identity of community members, it's also important to talk about how do community members determine who can participate in record-keeping decisions. So if these decisions can have such an impact on social memory and how a community is portrayed to the broader public, then that really suggests that participatory archiving is an important and powerful thing for a community to engage in. And so you have to think, well, who is the best person to wield the power over record-keeping decisions surrounding records? And that's something that the Rowland article looks at to varying levels of success, I would argue. So Roland really focuses on the participation of decisions surrounding records being connected to the connection that a person or a community has to the records or to the subject that the records are documenting. So for example, if a person or if a record documents something that a person experienced firsthand, then they should have a lot of power over the record keeping decisions surrounding those records. So they may be involved with the pre-creation planning, with the appraisal, the really impactful types of participation that we have discussed already. If a person identifies with records or the events depicted in a record, then they may only be involved with description and access decisions surrounding records. So they weren't necessarily involved in the event directly, but they maybe knew someone who was, or their grandparents were, and so they ought to have some power over participation and participatory decisions, but not as much as someone who actually experienced the events that the records are depicting. And then we have someone who can relate to the event or to the records. And so Roland suggests that they may be involved with participating in the form of annotations or contributing auxiliary materials. And then finally, people that are only involved with records or the events documenting records by doing research on them. And Roland suggests that these people really have a role in determining or participating in these records through, minor access decisions and perhaps some minor transformations. So as I've touched on, people who have experienced these events would have the deepest level of participation, and people doing research about these events and having no other connection, according to Roland at least, would have the most shallow or the most superficial participation. And Roland notes that different people may have the same relationship to the same record. So there may be, dozens of people that experience this event. And so theoretically, they would be able to have decisions over appraisal and pre-creation participation decisions. There may be a lot of people that relate to a particular event. It may be an entire community. And that can cause some difficulties and some tension in determining exactly who gets to make what decisions. On pages 213 and 214, Roland talks about the need to treat participation in decisions on a case-by-case basis, and about how inevitably this is going to create tension. If all the people who experienced an event can't come to the same conclusions about how to document that event, then this participation might cause a lot of tension within a community. What's interesting to note is that in mediated archival spaces, archivists who may have the least amount of connection between a record or the events depicted in a record often have the deepest level of participation in record keeping decisions surrounding those records. So I, as an archivist, may have absolutely no connection to the Stonewall riots in New York, but I might be the one that's making appraisal decisions about records related to that event. And so it really gives the deepest participation to people that have the least connection to the records. And that doesn't seem right to me. And participation which is more balanced on a person's connection to a set of records and giving those people the most power over record-keeping decisions, as opposed to giving archivists, which may have absolutely no connection to an event, seems like a more just and equitable distribution of power. Now, the community archivists, they may be more in this relate area. So if a record is in a community archives, that at least suggests that there is some relationship between the records and the community. And if a community, or if a community archivist is a part of that community, then they may well have more of a relationship to the records. So they may be more in this relate stage. So it might not be as much of an issue there, but at least with traditional archives, in which there might be a lot of separation between the archivist and the records and the events the records document, you know, that can be a big problem if they have the most power. One thing that Roland notes is that participatory powers in decision-making must be weighed against social needs. So in some instances, if people who were involved with an event say, well, no, we don't want these records to survive because they don't want to be held accountable for something that they did, then sometimes this power relationship that Roland describes needs to be sort of negated and overlooked if participation results in social harm. So I think that's an important context to add to this discussion. You don't want to give people the power to erase history that doesn't reflect well on them, or erase history that is going to hold them accountable. So again, this type of participation dynamic can create a lot of tension. You know, who within a community are the ones that can best identify with an event? Who within a community are the ones that can be considered to have truly experienced an event? Was it someone who was at the Stonewall riots, you know, someone who was protesting across the streets? Or there's a whole lot of room for interpretation really in all of these, except for maybe research. And what exactly participation can look like and who gets to make which decisions can be a big source of tension and debate. And that's something that we talked about earlier on in this semester. So it's important to note that as we sort of move up the pyramid here, this involves archives sharing more power. So if archives facilitate people who have experienced a certain event to make really meaningful decisions surrounding the record keeping of records, that involves archives sharing a lot of power with those people. And again, that's something that archives haven't traditionally been comfortable doing, or felt like doing that was in the best interests of their researchers. So turning this kind of dynamic into a practical way to determine who can participate in record-keeping decisions is something that is likely to make, especially mainstream archivists, a little uncomfortable, because again, it takes away power from archives. It suggests that archives haven't done a good job in the past, and not everyone is going to be comfortable admitting that or allowing this kind of relationship to exist. So we'll wrap things up by looking at some of the barriers to community participation in participatory archiving. On page 203, Roland talks about participation fatigue. So people may be just sick in participating in decisions about records. They may fear reprisal. So if a person in a community says, I think these record keeping decisions should be made, and other people feel differently, then this conflict might cause some people to, feel like they are in danger. On page 202, Roland notes that this kind of participation may be beyond the mission and capabilities of community archives especially, which is certainly understandable. Roland also talks about the dispersed nature of official or organizational records and how that can make it difficult to set up some kind of system where community members are able to provide annotations or other information about records. And so just generally speaking, the infrastructure required to allow really deep and broad participation to occur can be really difficult to put into place. So even if archivists were willing to share this power, actually turning this kind of participation into practice can be a difficult and complex and labor-intensive project. On page 218, Roland notes the need for equal access for contending parties, and that may be really difficult to balance and to figure out what that equal access looks like. And Roland also notes the difficulty in identifying and opening participation to the other, or people that have been excluded from archival decision-making processes. So how do you even figure out who's being excluded, and how do you sort of go about approaching them and attempting to open participation in record-keeping decisions to the people that you've identified? And again, I think the tension that participation can cause within a community can be a really big barrier as well. So if people feel like certain members of the community who are participating in record-keeping decisions surrounding community records, if they feel like these people shouldn't be participating, or they shouldn't be participating to the degree that they are participating, that can cause a lot of angst in conversations. And community members may feel like outsiders are making decisions for them and representing the community in a way that isn't accurate and doesn't really portray the community in a truthful light. And that can certainly lead to people not wanting to get involved with participation and can make participatory archiving a much more difficult and controversial and fraught activity to engage in. Okay, so we'll call it a day there. So we've talked about participation in community archives pretty much every week in this semester. And, you know, again, it is something that makes a community archive. So it's incredibly important to talk about what this participation is meant to do, the different types of participation that can exist, and just thinking practically about who should and shouldn't be involved in participating in the representation of a community through traditional archives, through community archives, or through different types of community memory projects. So again, we'll look at more specific examples of participation later on in the semester, but I just kind of wanted to set the stage for some of the issues surrounding participation and how a community archive, or really any archive, might go about navigating through some of these issues. So thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and take care of yourselves.